Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Caribbean Equality Projects and UnLocal virtual forum to educate community members on the Excluded Workers Fund. My name is Mohammed Kiumin. I use he and they pronouns. I'm the founder and executive director of the Caribbean Equality Project, a community-based organization that advocates for, empowers, and represents Black and Brown LGBTQ Caribbean immigrants in New York City. Founded in 2015 in response to anti-LGBTQ hate violence in Queens, Richmond Hill, CEP conducts year-round digital and in-person outreach to amplify our organizing to promote public education, healing, civic engagement, storytelling, and cultural and social programming. The organization's work focuses on advocacy for LGBTQ plus and immigrants' rights, gender equity, racial justice, immigration and mental health services, and ending hate violence in the Caribbean diaspora. I am privileged and honored to be in this virtual space with you all today. Again, welcome to the Caribbean Equality Projects virtual Excluded Workers Fund info session, a partnership made possible by our community partners at UnLocal, a community-centered nonprofit organization that provides direct immigration legal representation, community education, outreach, and advocacy for New York's undocumented immigrants. Please join me in welcoming my co-host for tonight, Theo Brown, the Public Relations Officer for the Caribbean Equality Project.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone out there can hear me. I am Theo Brown, pronouns he, him, his, and I'm the Public Relations Officer for Caribbean Equality Project, just like Mohammed, my co-host, just introduced us as, of course, New York City's 501c3 that advocates for the Caribbean LGBTQ voices. As the Public Relations Officer, I help to promote and get the word out about CEP, the services that we provide and how we best serve and help the community. For this evening, so tonight's webinar includes an educational presentation on the Excluded Workers Fund, eligibility, application submission, and an interactive audience Q&A.
For the past 17 months, excluded workers, including undocumented LGBTQ plus people and asylum seekers, have been forced to navigate and survive the COVID-19 pandemic without any unemployment or federal relief. The Caribbean Equality Project's COVID-19 Emergency Fund and Food Justice Program have been an essential source of financial support and resources to access culturally responsive, nutritional foods during these challenging times, particularly for our impacted Black and Brown immigrant communities in Queens and Brooklyn. After 1 year of campaigning for pandemic relief, a coalition of community organizations rallied, marched, and demanded legislators provided relief for essential and excluded workers. From hunger strikes throughout New York City and Westchester to shutting down the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges, immigrants put their bodies on the front line for a historic victory, a $2.1 billion Excluded Workers Fund.
Now, now the with this fund, the fund was created specifically for undocumented people and families with mixed immigration statuses that have not been able to access financial assistance that others have had access to because of their immigration status. Now, thank you for joining us tonight as we continue to create educational opportunities to get our community the money they have fought so valiantly for and which they rightfully deserve. With all that being said, we're going to bring on now Victoria Gion, who is a staff attorney and an Equal Justice Works Fellow at UnLocal. Victoria works with UnLocal's Queer Immigrant Justice Project, formerly known as QIJP, which provides assistance in immigration law for primarily queer immigrants. Victoria?
Victoria, I don't think we can hear you.
Okay, hello?
Yes.
Yes, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened because it was working before. But in any case, thank you so much, Theo, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Jian, and I'm a staff attorney at UnLocal, as well as the Equal Justice Works Fellow here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about UnLocal and the Queer Immigrant Justice Project. So UnLocal specializes in providing pro bono legal services, which or pro bono meaning free legal services to immigrants who are going through the asylum process. We also specialize in education and outreach, and we go out to the community and educate people on developments in the law. And we also help the community learn more about immigration and related issues. So in that process, we partnered with schools and other nonprofits to do presentations like these, or to hold clinics in collaboration with some of the other attorneys from UnLocal. And as Theo mentioned, I mostly work within UnLocal's Queer Immigrant Justice Project, which helps LGBTQ immigrants in asylum cases, green card applications, work authorizations, and other matters. So as a part of my fellowship, I not only serve queer immigrants through that process, but I also am trying to expand UnLocal's reach and KEJIP's reach to those who identify as LGBTQ Asians, who are often left out in both queer spaces and Asian spaces. And UnLocal and the Caribbean Equality Project connected as a result of this goal, as I understand that the Caribbean Equality Project serves those who may be a part of the Caribbean Asian diaspora. So it's been a great pleasure working with the Caribbean Equality Project so far. And should you have any questions about UnLocal or the Queer Immigrant Justice Project, you can ask in the Q&A or contact me at victoria@unlocal.org.
Thank you for that, Victoria. And now I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Denise Hernandez. Denise is the Education and Outreach Coordinator at UnLocal, an immigration legal services organization. They frequently facilitate community presentations on a variety of topics, including Know Your Rights and legal and policy updates. Please join me in welcoming Denise Hernandez, who will facilitate our presentation on the Excluded Workers Fund.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much, Theo, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here with you all on this topic that I know a lot of folks will have a lot of questions on, right? As Theo mentioned, it is an extremely recent development and one that has been so much fought for. And I know a lot of folks are looking forward to applying and being able to access the financial benefits of the application. So if we could bring up the presentation, that would be great. And we will go ahead and get started. Mohammed gave us some much needed background on the Excluded Workers Fund. Like he mentioned, A lot of folks went on hunger strike for 23 days in New York City, and they very fortunately won. I think it's very much a testament to the power of organizing, right? And folks fighting for what their communities need, and ultimately being successful. So today's presentation will cover, first and foremost, what is the Excluded Workers Fund? We are also going to discuss the eligibility criteria, of which there are many, so we will go through a breakdown of that. We will also discuss the documents that are needed to apply as a part of the online application. And lastly, what folks can expect when they apply from beginning to end. And so I encourage you all to please post any questions that you might have in the comments. We will also have significant time at the end for any questions. Like I said, I know a lot of folks will have questions on any of the material, any clarifications. So please go ahead and engage on social media. We will see your questions and we will queue them up both during the presentation and afterwards as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit on the, there we go, on the Excluded Workers Fund. It is set to distribute 2.1 billion with a B dollars in direct cash assistance for workers who have been ineligible. So that means they did not receive New York State unemployment benefits or federal COVID-related income relief. We know that, of course, the past year has been extremely financially difficult for many families. A lot of folks lost their sources of income, their jobs, and a lot of folks who have immigration status, who have access to a green card or legal permanent residency, were able to apply for unemployment benefits that at one point during the pandemic were distributing up to $600 additional per week. But of course, we know the undocumented community did not have access to those funds. And so this new fund is seeking to address and distribute financial assistance to that community specifically. Next slide, please. So a note on who is eligible to apply. In order to be eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund program, we'll see the eligibility criteria on the next slide. First and foremost, you must be an adult, so you must be over 18 years old. That is to say that if you are, for example, a teenager who worked under the age of 18, unfortunately, at this time, you are not eligible to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. So you must be over 18 years old. You must have resided in New York State prior to the pandemic. And so the date that New York State has established is March 27th, 2020, so roughly right at the beginning of the pandemic here in New York State. And additionally, you must now currently today live in New York State. Additionally, you must not have been eligible for and did not receive unemployment insurance or any other COVID-19 income relief or specified benefits from the state or federal government. Now, I do want to amend this that even just in the past 24 hours, I have received additional information. If you see here on the slide, there is a little X on an image of a sample stimulus check. The new information that I've seen since actually creating these slides is that if you or someone in your family received a stimulus check, of which there were 3 that were distributed by the IRS, by the federal government, that does not necessarily disqualify you from being able to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. So specifically at this time, if you did not receive unemployment benefits, you would be eligible to apply. And if your family receives stimulus checks, you would also, sorry, I have it backwards. If your family received unemployment benefits from New York State, you are not eligible. Why? Because your family was receiving financial assistance over the course of the past year. However, if you or your family received a stimulus check, that does not necessarily disqualify you from being able to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. Folks with various immigration statuses were able to access stimulus checks. So for example, folks who might have applied for and received asylum and had a social security number, and by virtue of having that social security number, were able to receive a stimulus check. It might mean that you are still eligible to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. Next slide, please. Some more eligibility criteria. So we've gone over 3. There were a couple more. Over the course of the past year, so from March of last year to March of this year, you must have had a gross income, so that means a total income for the year of less than about $26,000. Additionally, you must be able to demonstrate via documentation, which we will go over in a couple of slides, that you worked and received compensation. That means that you were paid for the work that you were doing for at least 6 weeks prior to losing your income during the pandemic. So for example, if you were working as a delivery worker at a restaurant, and let's say you started in, even if you started during the pandemic, let's say you started in April of last year, you worked for at least 6 weeks, and then unfortunately your employer said that the restaurant had to close. As long as you can demonstrate that you were working at your previous site of employment for at least 6 weeks, you should be eligible to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. Additionally, you need to have worked, again, at least 15 hours a week. So that means that some part-time workers will be eligible to apply. Next slide, please. And lastly, during the pandemic, you must have lost at least 50% of your earnings to your household at any point in time between February 23rd of 2020 to April 1st of this year. And that could be due to a variety of reasons, right? It could be that you were totally unemployed, right? So for example, the example that we just gave of the delivery worker whose restaurant unfortunately had to close during the pandemic because of COVID. You might have also had partial unemployment, right? So for example, if you had your hours reduced and that resulted in a loss of income to you or your household. Additionally, of course, we know the pandemic that we have been living through for the past year is a major health risk. We know many of us have unfortunately lost members of our community. We know people who have gotten sick with COVID. And so if you were incapacitated, right, because of COVID-19 during the pandemic, and because of that, you were unable to work, that would also make you eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. Additionally, you may also qualify if you became responsible for a majority of your household's income because the head of your household passed away or they became disabled. So for example, that might apply to, for example, a spouse, right? A spouse whose other spouse contracted COVID-19, became disabled during the pandemic, and they had to begin working, right, as the primary breadwinner, as responsible for the majority of the household's income, even though they didn't see, right, as per the previous outlines, a reduction in income. There was a significant change to their family's financial circumstances, right? Again, because someone passed away or due to disability. So you may qualify through that as well. So next slide, please. Now that we've gone over a little bit on eligibility, and like we mentioned, we saw several criteria, right? We covered at least 6. If folks have any questions in relation to that, please feel free to post them in the comments. And we can clarify some questions around eligibility during the Q&A. But now that we've covered that, we also want to do some myth busting because, like we said, a lot of this information is brand new. And even in the past couple of weeks, right, I have heard murmurings of misinformation, right, in the immigrant community. And so we're going to do some fact checking here. So myth number 1, I need to have been working during the entire pandemic to be considered an excluded worker. I heard this through a colleague of mine, that the name of the fund, right, the Excluded Workers Fund, could actually be understood as a misnomer, right? The word worker is in the title. And so someone might assume that, well, that means that you must have worked during the pandemic, right? And the answer is no, that is false. It's called the Excluded Workers Fund because it was created for folks who have been excluded from other financial benefits, right? So like we said, for example, folks who have not been able to access New York State unemployment. And so you do not need to have worked during the pandemic to be eligible. In fact, it's your unemployment, right, that makes you eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. Next slide, please. Myth number 2, my employment income stayed about the same during the pandemic. So my household income didn't change. So that means I am not eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. And the answer to this is, well, not necessarily, right? We said that one of the circumstances that might make you eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund is if you became the head of household, right, during the pandemic, because of death or disability of your family's breadwinner. Again, that counts as a significant financial change. And so you may still be eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. Next slide, please. Another scenario. I was able to access New York State unemployment during the last year, so I am not eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. This is true. So if you were able to access, again, I'm going to note the change on stimulus checks. That is a recent change. If you were able to access stimulus checks, you may still be eligible to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund, given that you meet all of the other criteria. However, if you access New York State unemployment insurance, you are likely not eligible to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. Next slide, please. I've also heard concerns around data protection, right? The application is going to ask a lot of personal information, right? From your name to your address, to information around your financial circumstances, right? Some tax documents might be submitted. And so, of course, understandably, many of us might have concerns about the data that we are submitting to the New York State government, right? And so I want to assure everyone that, yes, the information that you submit to New York State will be kept safe. The Excluded Worker Fund legislation built in very strong legal protections for the personal information that is submitted with the application. Next slide, please. We know that a lot of folks, of course, have concerns around their personal information because there might be concerns that it will be shared with immigration enforcement agencies, right? A lot of folks in our community, in the immigrant community, have a mistrust, right, of the police, of government agencies, rightfully so. And so there might be a fear that this information will be shared with federal authorities. Essentially, the application can be used to disclose, right, that you are undocumented, that you are working within the United States. And so it's very important to know that your information will not be shared. There are criminal penalties that have been, again, built into the legislation around the creation of the Excluded Workers Fund for disclosing any information to immigration enforcement authorities. And then we may ask ourselves, right, so then what are the documents that I am submitting being used for? Those documents are only being used to determine eligibility, and they cannot be shared with anyone outside of the application process unless it is to comply with a judicial warrant or a court order, right? So again, there are incredibly strong data protections. That information is not being shared with ICE, right, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or any other enforcement agencies outside of New York State. And so it's very important to highlight this, right, because we want to ensure that as many people as possible apply and receive access to these funds. Next slide, please. I do want to make a note, though, on the previous point about concerns about immigration enforcement agencies, that a little note on the risks of applying. It is very important to know that if you go ahead and apply for the Excluded Workers Fund, that you be completely honest, right, in the documents that you are submitting, because at the very end of the application, you will be asked to provide essentially a digital signature, right, that all of the information you provided is correct, that it is complete, that it is accurate. And so it's important to know that if anyone, for example, makes false claims, that could potentially be used to have serious consequences, right, including potentially immigration-related consequences. So again, I encourage everyone to apply, but please make a note to be as completely honest and truthful in your application as possible. So now, how exactly can one go about applying? The link to the application is available on the screen. It is available via New York State at this website, and the application is available in 13 different languages. The languages are listed here on the screen. And it is primarily an online application that can be completed either via a computer and a smartphone as well. So if you have a web-enabled smartphone, that can be used to complete your application. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered what the application, who can apply, what documents will we need to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund? Next slide, please. There are three major areas of document collection. First and foremost, of course, you will be asked to confirm your identity, right? Your name, who you are. Secondly, you will be asked to confirm your residency, and that will be both where you lived prior to the pandemic, as well as the fact that you currently live in New York State. And lastly, you will be asked to confirm your work-related eligibility, right? So where you were working, what circumstances changed during the pandemic that make you eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. And the application is primarily document-based. So the documents that you will provide, as we will cover in a couple of slides, will actually determine how much funding you or your family is eligible to receive. So a note on all of the documents before we go into a more in-depth document list that can be submitted with the Excluded Workers Fund. At least one of the documents that you submit must be a photo identification. So that means that it includes both your name and a photo of yourself visible on the ID. And additionally, at least one of them must show your date of birth. Additionally, all of the documents that you submit must be certified by the issuing agency. So that means that it has a very clear logo, right, of who is the agency that created that identification document. So for example, if you submit a New York State driver's license or driving or learning permit, it will very clearly have the logo, right, of the Department of Motor Vehicles, right, that certifies that the document is real, that it was issued by New York State. And similarly, some foreign documents, right, that are not US based can be accepted as a part of the application, but it must be clear who created that identification, right? Who was the issuing agency of that ID. The documents that are submitted additionally also must be unexpired, right? So that means that they are currently valid, that they have not expired. And this is unfortunately, we know, a criteria that may disqualify currently a lot of folks, and we will cover that in a second. There is advocacy that is taking place so that this changes, right, for New York State to allow the acceptance of some expired documents, which would, of course, we know, allow many more folks to apply. But as of right now, any documents that you submit with your application must be currently valid and not expired. Documents that you submit, for the most part, of course, if they are in English, they can be submitted in their original form. However, if you submit any foreign documents, right, that are not in English and are in another language, they must be submitted with a certified English language translation of the document. And lastly, any documents that are submitted shouldn't be damaged, right? They should be complete, right? So if they're torn, unfortunately, they cannot be submitted. If they're incomplete, stained, damaged, they also cannot be submitted. So they should be very clear, visible, and whole. Next slide, please. So now category number 1 for identity documents. Here on this slide, I included actual images of what some of the documents look like that you can submit. The very next slide after this will be essentially a duplicate of this slide. However, it will be much more text-based and text-heavy. But first and foremost, any documents that can be submitted to verify your identity include but are not limited to, right? I do want to highlight that this is not a complete list. A New York State ID, a New York City ID, also known as the ID NYC, which is the orange identification on the rightmost side. That is accessible to folks via multiple sites across all 5 boroughs. And we know many folks may already have them. I do want to note that the ID NYC program essentially extended all of the cards that were set to expire in 2020 due to the pandemic. So they are valid until the end of 2021. Again, to the point of the fact that all of the documents that are submitted need to be currently valid. So that is something very important that I wanted to highlight. You can also submit a New York State driver's license or learner's permit. You can submit a US passport or a foreign-born passport. All of the documents that you submit, the requirement is that they add up to a total of 4 points. And the extended list, as well as the point values of each of these documents, is available on the New York State website. However, this is just a very brief overview so folks can get an idea of what documents they may need to collect in order to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. Next slide, please. In addition to that, right, the list of potential documents that you can submit to prove your identity is fairly long and extensive, including, for example, a marriage certificate, any documents related to a divorce judgment, birth certificates, right, including if they were issued by a foreign country, any sort of photo identification that may be from your country of origin can also be included, again, with a certified translation. Any diplomas or transcripts that you might have from US high schools or college or university. If you have any identification cards from your employer, right, from your previous place of employment, those can also be used to verify identity, as well as, for example, pay stubs or written employment offers. The list is fairly extensive. And again, these documents will need to be added up to be a total of 4 points. Next slide, please. The next category of documentation is residency. So you will need to prove, again, where you lived prior to March of 2020, prior to the pandemic, and where you currently reside. Those 2 addresses might be completely different, right? And that is fine as long as they are both within New York State. And so, again, a multitude of documents can be used to prove this. You can submit the same documents, right, to prove both your identity and your residence as well. For example, a driver's license, of course, very clearly includes your address on it as well as the ID NYC. You can also submit a federal tax return, a 1040, which we have here on the screen, or any other proof of filing with either New York State or the federal government that will very clearly have your address. Another common route that we know folks will use to prove where they resided in New York State are utility bills. That includes electric bills, gas bills, internet, cable, water, any documents related to trash, recycling, that very clearly has your name and your address. Banks or credit card statements are also acceptable. Any hospital or medical documentation, any documents that were issued by a health institution, including, for example, health insurance, as well as any jury summons, court orders, or other documents that are from a court within New York State. Next slide, please. Again, here we have an extensive list. I do want to highlight again that this is not the complete list. So if you do not see a document that you currently have in your possession that could be submitted with the Excluded Workers Fund. I would encourage you to check out the New York State website, where the extended list will be included. However, these are some of the more common forms of documentation that we know more folks will have access to. The last thing I will highlight is when the documentation that you provide to prove where you currently live will need to be dated from March 20th of this year onward. And so the date will need to be very clearly shown on that document, with the exception being for documents that are listed here in the white box. So that would include a driver's license, a non-driving ID, an ID-NYC card, as well as a learner's permit. We know that, for example, if you received your learner's permit a couple of years ago, that can be used to prove your current address and doesn't have a date restriction. Any other document will need to be from March or onwards. So for example, if you have a utility bill, an acceptable document would be a utility bill from May, for example, of this year, of 2021. Next slide, please. And so lastly, we come to the most important category of your documentation, which is the employment documentation. And I call it the most important category because the documents that you provide within this category will determine your financial award, essentially. So there are two different tiers of financial awards that are being offered through the Excluded Workers Fund. One a fairly large award and another smaller award. The large award is called Tier 1, which is offering a maximum of $15,600. You might ask yourself, well, how did they come up with that number? That number is equivalent to about $300 a week for 52 weeks, 52 weeks being the duration of a year. So $300 per week for the past year. And that is how they arrived at the number of $15,600. Of course, much more documentation will be needed to be able to access this, this tier, and we will go over that in a second. The second tier, known as Tier 2, offers a smaller award of $3,200, and that is the equivalent of 3 stimulus checks that were distributed by the federal government over the course of the past year. And so it's important to highlight that both of these amounts will be taxed at about 5%. And so the actual award that ends up being impactful for either you or your family might be a little bit smaller because taxes will be taken out of it. However, these are the two financial award levels available through the Excluded Workers Fund. So now how do we access the two different tiers? Next slide, please. Essentially, again, we talked about the point system that is has been assigned to the identification documents. Similarly, there is a point system that has been assigned to the two different tiers. And so you need a total of 5 points in order to be able to access the maximum amount of $15,600. And so the various forms of documentation that you could provide include proof of filing a New York State tax return for either 2018, 2019, or 2020, right? So any of the past 3 years through the Department of Taxation and Finance. Again, that is a New York State tax return. So that is not a federal tax return, so a 1040. That means you need to have lived here in New York State in order to file that document, either full-time or part-time here in New York State. Alternatively, you could provide up to 6 weeks of pay stubs or wage statements in the 6 months that were prior to the date that your financial circumstances changed. So for example, from the date that you were laid off, either completely or partially, had your hours reduced. You can also submit W-2 forms from either 2019 or 2020, or a 1099 if you were an independent contractor. I do want to highlight, backtracking to the first document that we talked about, the New York State tax return. from either of the past 3 years. If you submit that, additionally, we have here an image of an ITIN number card, and that is because you will be asked to submit proof of a currently valid US ITIN number in order to be eligible for the 5 points to access the maximum award. The final category of document that could make you automatically eligible for the maximum award, because it is equivalent to 5 points, is a letter from your employer. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please. A letter from your employer would need to very clearly state the dates that you were working at this previous employer and the reasons for your loss of income. So that might include, right, that they reduce your hours, that you were completely laid off, that you were unemployed for a period of time. And it must clearly demonstrate the employer's mailing address, the address of the site where you worked within New York State, and either of a various set of formal numbers that any employer within New York State should have, including a unemployment insurance number or a federal employment identification number. Those are numbers that are assigned to, for example, businesses so that they can pay taxes in the same way that individuals have, for example, Social Security numbers or ITIN numbers. Businesses also have numbers that they use to pay taxes to the IRS. And so that number would need to be clearly included on the letter that they provide to you. And so, of course, we know that it can be challenging, right, to ask an employer for this documentation. They might not want to provide you with this letter. There are documents available on the Excluded Workers website that outline some strategies that you can use to discuss this with your employer. But essentially, I would encourage you all, if this documentation would make you eligible for the maximum award, to consider asking your previous employer to provide this documentation. And if you need any assistance with this process, please feel free to contact us at UnLocal so that we can assist you with this process. Next slide, please. So those are the documents that would automatically qualify you to access the maximum award, right? The $15,600. There are different point totals assigned to other types of documents that could prove that you worked within New York State. So that includes documents that are equivalent to 3 points that are highlighted here in green. So that would be, for example, if you filed a complaint within New York State regarding any wages that you were owed. So, for example, if you were suffering from wage theft, right, your employer was not paying you what they should have during the time that they employed you, and you filed a complaint within New York State for a period greater than 6 weeks, you may have that documentation, and that would additionally make you eligible for the 3 point total, which can still be used to access the maximum award if it is combined with other forms of documentation. The second document that might make you eligible for still the full award would be any records of regular direct deposits or deposits of transfers from an employer. So, for example, if you could provide several bank statements showing that you regularly, right, every 2 weeks or however many weeks was your pay period, that you regularly received direct deposits or payments from your employer via your bank account, that could also potentially make you eligible for the maximum award. On the right-hand side in yellow, we have the documents that are equivalent to 1 point. And so any of these, the documents listed here in yellow, can be used to combine for a total of 3 points, which would make you eligible for the smaller award amount, right, of the $3,200. Unfortunately, if you only have documentation from the yellow category, right, the one that is equivalent to 1 point, those cannot be combined to access the larger award amount, right, so tier 1. But of course, we know that any type of financial assistance is significant, and so I would definitely encourage you to apply. irrespective of whatever your point total is of the documentation that you have available. Some of the documents that are included here in Tier 1 that could make you eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund include direct communication with your employer, including any work invoices, sales receipts, instructions that you may have received from your employers via email, text, whatever it might be, any social media posts or texts that demonstrate that you had a relationship with your employer, specifically a work relationship, as well as any record of regular cashing of paychecks or transfer of funds. So if you have receipts of cashes that you, of checks that you cashed out, that is of course a record that you were paid for your employment, and that can also be submitted as a part of the application. And so I do want to highlight that we know that for many folks, gathering all of these documents can, number one, be challenging, right, for a multitude of reasons. And so you may not currently have all of the documents that you need to apply. However, right, I would encourage you to meet with an agency such as UnLocal. There are many agencies around New York State that are providing assistance with applying for the New York State Excluded Workers Fund to assess what sort of documents you may currently have access to and whether there are steps that you can take to collect the documentation that would allow you to be eligible. So for example, you may not currently be eligible because maybe your foreign passport, right, your passport from your country of origin is expired, right? And so in that instance, right, it might take a visit to your local consulate to issue a new passport, right, which would then make you eligible to have the documentation needed to apply. Similarly, right, if you don't currently have an ID-NYC, there are many sites across New York City that you can visit to access an ID-NYC. Additionally, we know that, of course, some folks may have never paid taxes, right? You may have been paid in cash, have never paid taxes. And so if you were to apply for an ITIN number and file taxes for the first time for the year 2020, that would make you eligible to have the documents needed to apply to the Excluded Workers Fund. So please don't hesitate to reach out to organizations that can connect you with these services, right? Either identifying your local consulate, your local ID-NYC site, or possibly connecting you with tax assistance sites, right, that can assist you in filing taxes for the first time, because those resources are available. Next slide, please. I'm going to do my best to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions, of which I know I'm sure a lot of folks have a lot of questions. What counts as income for the purposes of the Excluded Workers Fund? Essentially, any payments that you directly receive for work that you completed, right, in excess of 15 hours. So as long as you are working 15 hours a week, you are providing labor for an employer and you were paid for that, that counts as income. However, there's a long list of financial streams that do not count as income. And so that would include, for example, any scholarships that you received if you were a student, any returns from stipends, for example, if you had any lottery winnings, that does not count as income, any child support that you may have been receiving, any payments from an insurance policy, any legal settlements, Social Security, pensions, and so on. That does not count as income, right? Specifically, when we discuss income in relation to this application, it is for work that you completed for an employer. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered the various documents that can be submitted with the Excluded Workers Fund, some questions that you might want to ask yourself in order to see what sorts of documentation you might provide include thinking about where you were working, right, for the 6 months prior to when you experienced a reduction in income. That might be one site, it might be multiple sites, right? Who was your employer or your supervisor, right? How would you communicate with them? If you remember, one of the possible categories of documentation would be text messages, right? So if you have text messages proving that you worked for somebody, that can be used as documentation of your work. How are you paid, right? How are you compensated? How often, right? Was it every month, every 2 months, every 2 weeks? What receipts can show that, right? It might be via a bank. It might be that you were cashing out your checks, right? And if you have those receipts, that can be used as proof of income as well. And so again, a supporting agency that assists you in applying for the Excluded Workers Fund can help you figure out which document categories you might have and what documentation you can submit to accompany your application. Next slide, please. So again, the document list that we provided is not the full list, right? It only covers some of the more common categories. And so to see the extended list, please check out the New York State website. Lastly, we get to application steps, of which the application is fairly simple. There are 3 steps. Number 1 would be, of course, creating your account with either a phone number or email address. Once you have an account, you can save your progress. So for example, if you start the application, need to collect some documents and continue the application, a week later, the application should be able to save your progress. And it is very, very important to keep your login information safe, right? Make sure that you can sign in again in the future, because if there are any errors with your documentation that you need to correct, you will need to log into your account again in order to access the documents that you submitted. Step 2, the application will ask you a series of questions to determine your eligibility and how much you will receive, right? Either the tier 1 amount or the tier 2 amount. And step 3, you will submit the documents to New York State, and they will review your application, and they may contact you if they need you to follow up with any documents via either email or text. So it's important to, once you submit your application, to be on top of course, your phone, your text, or your email. The application will ask you what your preferred method of communication is, right? So if you notify that you prefer to be communicated via text, that is how they will contact you if they have any issues with your application. Next slide. So now another very important question that I want to cover in regards to documentation and the application. And of course, that is, what if I am a cash economy worker, right? So this would, for example, apply to street vendors, anyone who was paid cash for their services, or any labor that they were performing. They might not have access to, of course, tax returns, any sort of documentation proving that you worked in the cash economy. And so at this time, we are awaiting further guidance from New York State on how you may be able to apply. Because of course, given the eligibility criteria, you may be eligible to apply, but simply not have the documents that the application is currently requiring of folks. And so of course, again, I want to highlight that right now there is ongoing advocacy, right, to have New York State change some of the documents that they are requiring that currently are very, very strict. And so we are hopeful that folks who may have been paid cash will soon be able to apply as soon as we receive additional guidance from New York State. Next slide, please. Some general application tips are that you will be asked to submit images of all of the documents that you provide in either a PDF, JPEG, or PNG. Any photos taken with your phone, for example, should already be in one of these formats. Make sure that the images are clear, right? Of course, you don't want to take photos of your documents in a dark room, right? Make sure the light is on, make sure the documents are clear, they're not blurry or incomplete. You can, again, submit the application via a mobile device. So if you have a phone that has a camera, that can allow you to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund. And lastly, some documents will be, you'll be asked to submit both a photo of the front and the back, and the application will queue you if that is the case. Next slide, please. Lastly, of course, what happens once you submit your application, right? And how will you know that your application was successful? As of right now, New York State is expecting there to be about a 6-week processing time for the application, right? So from the time you submit to the time that you receive the funding that you are awarded should be about a month and a half, right? 6 weeks. It may be that the application needs additional information from you, right? So either perhaps maybe an image wasn't clear or a document was missing. If that is the case, New York State will contact you via either phone call, text, or email, whatever your preferred method that you indicated on your application was. And we have the numbers listed here. So for example, if they were to call you, the call will come from the first number that is listed. If they were to email you, it will come directly from the email address on the screen. And so once you are successful with your application, you will receive a visa preloaded card that will be sent to the address that you indicated on your application. Every single applicant will receive an update on whether their application has been accepted or rejected, right? So you should not be waiting for several months, not being clear on whether on what happened with your application, right? Again, every single applicant will receive that update. And so what happens if your application is rejected, right? Or if it is denied? If your application is denied, you can appeal that decision within 3 days. And so that is why it is very important once you submit to be on top of all of your channels of communication, right? Because you will have 3 days to appeal that decision once you receive it. Next slide, please. And lastly, I do want to highlight that it's important to note that the Excluded Workers Fund application is free, right? It's a free application. There is no cost to apply. And additionally, any application assistance is free, right? Like I mentioned, UnLocal, along with many other organizations in New York City and New York State, are providing assistance with this application. That assistance is free, right? So if you see any, for example, notarios or other agencies in New York attempting to charge you for their services or to apply, do not pay them, right? Protect your money, protect your information. Do not pay them to apply or for their assistance. And if you want to take the additional step of reporting them, you can do so with the Attorney General. But again, do not pay to either apply or to have anyone help you with the application. Next slide, please. With that, we are at the end. I think we went a little bit over time, but hopefully covering all the information and some of the major categories of questions that folks might have. With that, I do want to open up the floor for any Q&A related to any of the topics we covered, right? Eligibility, documents, what happens when you apply. Please go ahead and ask away.
Denise, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. I know you covered a lot of our community members' question, and I know this was also part of the presentation. You were very intentional in making sure that the questions that community members may have about the application and documentation and around submission were included in your presentation. So for folks that are watching, I'm not sure about y'all, but I still have a few questions that I need answered. So if you have questions just like me, please comment, make them into the comment section. We will pin them on screen, and Denise will do her best to answer those questions for us today. And Denise, you touched on one of the questions earlier. And so the question, my first question would be, how can undocumented people demonstrate that they were employed but lost their job due to the pandemic, particularly for folks that were being paid with cash? Could you review that question for us, please? Oh, Denise, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much. So definitely, so we know a lot of folks are paid in cash, right? And so some of the ways that you might prove that you were employed are via any receipts that you had during the course of your labor. So for example, that might apply to maybe construction workers, right? If you worked in construction and routinely were asked to buy materials, right, to complete the work that you were performing, that might be one of the ways that you provide that documentation. If you had regular communication with your supervisor, right, or your boss, or whomever was employing you, a record of that communication, right, including and especially, I think it will be very important to highlight when that employment started, right, or a period of time for which you can provide that documentation. If you were paid in cash, also, another way that you might go ahead and become eligible to apply for the Excluded Workers Fund is by filing taxes for the first time, right? The fact that you do not have a W-2, that's a document that's provided oftentimes from employers to someone to file their taxes, but you don't necessarily need one in order to file taxes. You can file taxes on cash earnings. And so if you were to, you might be put in touch with an organization that is providing tax assistance, right? So you file taxes for the first time, and through that become eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund. But of course, we know folks who are paid in cash, currently there are many hoops, right, that folks are being asked to jump through and complete for this application. And so even with the above information, you may still not currently have or have the documentation needed to apply. And so again, I want to highlight that organizations like UnLocal, as well as many others across New York City and New York State, are aware of this very tight situation, right, that a lot of folks are in, right, that you are eligible, however, you were paid cash and might not have this track record to prove that that you can apply. And so right now there's a lot of ongoing advocacy with New York State to change some of their requirements so that many folks can still apply. And so that change might be something like a document of what's called self-attestation, right? That you simply write up a document outlining what your circumstances are, and you attest that they are true and accurate, and New York State accepts that as valid, right? However, right now that is currently not the case, right? We are waiting for changes to be made to the application. But I encourage folks to, if that is your situation, to await additional guidance if it is needed.
Thank you for that. Now, I know we're talking about folks that work in the cash economy, particularly cash economy workers, and one set of population includes our home cleaners, folks that do like domestic cleaning. So within the Caribbean community, the Indo-Caribbean community, the Afro-Caribbean community, the LGBTQ population, there is a large population of our community folks that does domestic work, or particularly serve as babysitters as well, right? And part of the presentation included getting a letter from an employer, and these employers would normally have like a tax ID. They would have the number that's associated with their unemployment. So what can folks do if they work for someone that employs them as a babysitter or that employs them as a cleaner? How can they obtain a letter, and what information would be needed in order for them to qualify?
That is a very good question. And I think right now at this moment in time, we would need to await additional guidance from the state, because exactly as you pointed out, Mohammed, most, we'll call them businesses, right, for example, that employ folks would have this identification number. And so someone who employs somebody else, right, on an individual basis, either for childcare, right, for babysitting, or for home cleaning, simply won't have that, right, because their household is not a business necessarily. However, someone is still being paid to work there, right? And so I think that definitely falls in the category of circumstances that we are awaiting additional information on.
Thank you for that. So I just got a text. a question via my inbox. So thank you all for submitting the questions however you want to. So the question I received was, how many community members of a family can submit an application?
That's a great question. My understanding currently is that individual folks can submit an application, given that each individual person meets all of the criteria and also can submit the necessary paperwork. So yes, as of right now, I'm not aware of any restrictions around how many folks in a household can apply to the Excluded Workers Fund. It's very similar to, for example, we outlined how the two awards were calculated, right? So the large award is equivalent to $300 per week. The smaller award is for the equivalent of 3 stimulus checks, right, over the course of the past year combined. For example, in the case of the stimulus checks, right, for a household that had 3 adults, right, each individual adult received their own stimulus checks. And so given that, you know, the parallel is there, again, as long as each individual meets the eligibility requirements, can submit their own documentation, to my knowledge right now, there is no limit on how many folks in a household can apply.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. I know for folks very similar to like Caribbean households, we have a lot of folks that lost their jobs and folks that are undocumented, simply had no source of income, right? So thank you to the folks that submit that question. We want to make sure that we answer all your questions. Please continue to make them in the comments, or if you don't want to, please DM me if you have me on social, and I will ask them as well. So one of the other question I did have for you, Denise, is how soon can community members contact organizations to submit an application? And I know before you answer that, I know that for CEP, we have a number of folks that have already signed up to submit an application through UnLocal. Majority of those folks RSVP'd for this webinar. And after this webinar, we will then put those folks in contact with UnLocal so they can begin their application or to get more guidance on the documents that they need to submit their application. But in terms of the general public who are not on our RSVP list, how soon can folks contact UnLocal with questions around an application?
Great. The short answer is immediately, right? This application opened up actually Monday of this week, so it opened up just this week. It is brand new. And something I didn't mention earlier when the fund was being sort of introduced is that, again, we mentioned that it's $2.1 billion that have been allocated by the state to be distributed. And so those funds are available essentially until they run out, right? And so folks are encouraged to apply as soon as possible. I would encourage you all to definitely, if you are looking for additional assistance, please feel free to get in touch with UnLocal. We also received information that folks can be connected to organizations by calling 311, which is the city's informational hotline. You can call them for any general questions that you might have around New York City and New York City services. And so if you want to go ahead and do that, they also provide assistance in multiple languages to be connected with perhaps an organization that is more local to you in your borough. You can go ahead and do that. If you have any trouble reaching folks via 311, please feel free to get in touch with, again, either folks at UnLocal or the Caribbean Equality Project to identify an organization that is local to you that can provide the assistance you need and or answer any general questions that you might have. But yes, I would encourage folks to apply as soon as possible. So definitely go ahead and begin collecting your documents. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you for answering that. And, Denise is doing a really great job at answering these questions. But one of the things that Denise is also alluding to is these applications are on a first come, first served basis only, right? They are roughly about 500,000 undocumented people that lives in New York City. And this money will will literally run out if everyone applies. So as soon as you finish watching this presentation, please email Caribbean Equality Project at info@caribbeanequalityproject.org with any questions you may have. In the subject line, just put Excluded Workers Fund, and we will direct those questions to UnLocal. We will also connect you with UnLocal. We do have an audience question, and I'm going to have Denise respond to it. Denise, I think you're muted. It's okay. Virtual world. We're still getting used to it.
Yes, technical. Thank you, Mohammed. So the question is, in the eligibility requirements slide, are the documents in the yellow box only for tier 2, or if you have all 5, can you be eligible for tier 1? This is an excellent question. And so if we can pull up the slide. If not, that's okay. I think this slide will be accessible to folks after it concludes, and you can refer back to the slide that we're referring to here. But essentially, midway through the presentation, there was a slide split in half with documents that are worth 3 points and documents that are worth 1 point. The yellow box refers to documents that are worth 1 point. And so that included what we discussed around any receipts that you have, any text messages that you might have with an employer, any records of cash payments. And so the question is, can these 1 point documents be combined for a total of 5 points to access the larger amount, right? Tier 1, the $15,600. And unfortunately, the short answer is no. You cannot combine the documents from tier 1 to access that larger award. You must have at least one of the documents in the green box. So the documents that are equivalent to 3 points in order to access the large amount. So that would be, for example, combining 2 documents. There we go. Here's the slide. So again, we're referring to the yellow box, the one on the right. If you have all 5 of these categories, unfortunately, that does not make you eligible for the larger award. So you must have at least one of the green box documents. And so, for example, that might be that you have both and can combine them for a total of 6 points and access the award, or you have 1 3-point document and 2 1-point documents, right? And that's how you access the total of 5 for the maximum award. So if you have only documents from the yellow box, you can definitely still apply. However, you would be eligible for the smaller award of $3,200. How many points do you need to receive tier 2 funds? So 3 points. So you would need at least 3 from these 3 different categories of the yellow box to access the tier 2 funds. Great questions. Thank you so much for submitting. You're muted, Mohammed.
I am muted. Thank you for that question from our YouTube viewer. It's really important that we know that folks have questions around the Excluded Workers Fund, right? And the reason why we're hosting this webinar is to not only educate community members on the Excluded Workers Fund, but to also answer those questions and to facilitate opportunities for you all to submit applications. This is literally the people's money. This is our money. We have earned this money. Taxpayers have earned this money. Folks that have been excluded, essential workers that have been excluded from earning a stimulus check or earning any type of unemployment assistance deserve this money. So we want to make sure that we get you this money. So I really do want to thank UnLocal for partnering with us to bring these resources to our community members. I just received one last question, and we're going to be closing in a few minutes. So if you have any last minute questions, please put them in the comments so we can answer them. So this question is, how soon after someone submits an application will it be approved or denied or receive a denial notice?
How soon? It could be as soon as about a week, right? But so that's why we, again, to highlight, once you hit submit, definitely keep on top of your lines of communication, right? Your text messages, your calls, your emails, because right now what the state is anticipating is about a 6-week turnaround time, right? It could be shorter, right? We would love for it to be shorter to get folks their money as soon as possible. However, the flip side of that is might be longer, right? So right now our estimate is about 6 weeks, right? But again, it's very important to keep on top of your lines of communication, should that turnaround time be, for whatever reason, shorter or longer. But again, I do want to highlight, everyone should receive a response, right? And so even if your application was denied, you will know, right? You will be notified.
Thank you, Denise. And also towards the end of the presentation, you highlighted if someone is charging money to submit an application on someone's behalf, that they should really stop, right? We live in New York City, we live in New York State. We know that fraud occurs on a daily basis, but we want you all to know that you should not be paying anyone, no organization, no agency, no corporation, no business. No one should be charging you to submit an application on your behalf. We also want to remind you of identity theft. You should really be protecting your documents, protecting your private documents, your foreign passports, birth certificate. These are all documents that you should be protecting. So you should only go to an organization or an agency that you trust with these documents to submit an application. Please do not give these documents to anybody to submit an application on your behalf. If someone is telling you that they're going to charge you, but they need your documents, stop, do not give them anything. And we also encourage you to report this, right? We know that people are trying to scam folks out of money. And we do encourage you to report it to the New York General Attorney, and their telephone number, which was shared earlier, is 800-771-7755. Again, to report fraud to the New York State General Attorney's Office, their telephone number is 800-771-7755. And with that, if there are no more questions, I just really want to thank Denise for this presentation, who worked really hard on putting it together. Thank you for being such a trusting partner with the Caribbean Equality Project. We look forward to continuing this conversation around the Excluded Workers Fund via email, via DMs. Please reach out to Caribbean Equality Project if you have any questions. So Denise, thank you so much for that presentation. Any last minute thoughts or any last minute anything else you want to share before we bring on Theo to do our closing remarks?
Yes, thank you so much for having us. We know getting out this information is so important. And we're so glad that we were able to do it in a timely manner, right? Again, like I mentioned, the application just opened this week. So this is, I think, one of the first, definitely our first presentation, but maybe some of the first presentations that folks have access to. I do want to address one last question that I see that came in here via the comments. And that is, if you only have a document that is worth 3 points, can you access the tier 2, so the smaller amount? The answer is yes. If you only have 3 points, 1 3-point document, that would make you eligible for tier 2. And so with that, thank you all so much. And like Mohammed mentioned, please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or need any sort of support in accessing these funds. We know we're talking about thousands of dollars, and we know how life-changing, right, that can be, especially right now for folks in difficult financial circumstances. So again, thank you all so much, and we look forward to partnering further and offering more educational workshops like this.
Thank you again, Denise. And with that, I would love to also encourage folks to look into the Caribbean Equality Project's COVID-19 Emergency Relief Fund. This fund is specifically for Caribbean LGBTQ immigrants, which includes undocumented undocumented folks and asylum seekers in New York City. You can go on our website, CaribbeanEqualityProject.org, to learn more about our emergency relief fund. For folks that have disposable income, you can also continue to support this work by donating to the Caribbean Equality Project, which you can do on our website. We cannot do this work without our community support. We know that community members have been impacted by COVID, and we know that Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. And by directly donating to an organization like Caribbean Equality Project, you are helping us to redistribute that money to folks who may not qualify for the Excluded Workers Fund, but folks who actually need money right now while they wait for their application to be approved. And with that said, I would love to welcome back my co-host, my colleague, Theo Brown, to do our closing remarks. Theo, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you for that, Mohammed. Thank you for, we've just been given so much knowledge tonight and, received so much knowledge about these resources that are available to us as a community. And I'm ever grateful to learn something new each and every day, right? That's like a daily challenge, to learn something new each and every day. So we want to just say thank you to UnLocal and World is Rich Production, New York-based organizations that are out there in the community doing the work, holding down the fort and just in the trenches, helping our community members to realize their goals and their visions. We'll be working closely with UnLocal to help community members fill out their applications. For those who RSVP'd, we will be in contact with you to begin your application with our partners at UnLocal Inc. That is, of course, that team is also, of course, spearheaded by Denise Hernandez, whom you just heard from, and of course, Victoria Gion, that was also on this live. So community members can also call 311 to be connected to a community-based organization to help with the application process in terms of completing that application. And we can't thank you all enough as our audience for just staying glued to your screens, lending us your ears and your eyeballs for just about an hour or so, or hour and a half or so, just to get this knowledge and to, really see how we can plug into your life. Just like Mohammed just mentioned, please visit CaribbeanEqualityProject.org for further information about this specific live that we just presented in collaboration with UnLocal, of course, brought to you by World is Rich Productions, and also to check out the COVID-19 Emergency Relief Fund. That's an ongoing fundraising campaign to help out our communities in need. Consider making a donation today. Now, during the course of the summer, even with the increase in the number of persons receiving the COVID-19 vaccines, we have noticed an uptick and an increase in the number of variants of the coronavirus that are heavily impacting our Black and Brown communities, especially, right? At this time, we are strongly encouraging folks to continue wearing a mask. It is essential. It is, even after you have received the vaccine, it's quite recommended that you still wear your mask and practice proper COVID-19 safety hygiene by regularly washing your hands and sanitizing as regularly as possible. Try your best to social distance and practice other preventative measures. And last but not least, if you haven't already done so, please consider taking one of the approved COVID-19 vaccines available at sites across New York City and the tri-state area. So with that being said, I want to again thank everyone for being a part of this live. Thank you for participating. Thank you for lending us your attention. Thank you for staying attentive to all the knowledge and the information that you've received here tonight. And we just want to express our gratitude always to UnLocal, World is Rich Productions. And of course, this presentation was brought to you in part by the Caribbean Equality Project. Good evening. Be well.